She would then wrap them in a magazine cover, place them in her purse, and keep them with her at all times until her arrest a few days later. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Crime Corner with Jen, and for those of you who don't know, my name is Jen and I talk about true crime cases on this channel. Before we begin, please be sure to like, subscribe, and to turn on the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of my future videos. Jumping right into today's video, we're going to be talking about one of Japan's most notorious true crime cases. And at the heart of this story is a woman by the name of Sada Abe. Sada is well known in Japan for strangling her lover and then cutting off his private parts and carrying it around with her in her handbag. But before we talk about the crime itself, I do want to go over Sada's background with you guys because I think there's a lot of really important information in her past that definitely made a huge impact on who she became as an adult. Sada was born on May 28, 1905, as the seventh of 8 children. Sada's family owned a tatami mat making business, which they ran in an area called Kanda, located in Tokyo. Their family business seemed to be thriving in the early 1900s, and Sada's family were considered to be upper middle class. However, their lives were far from perfect. In fact, this family seemed to continuously face one bad luck after another, and it really did seem like they were never really able to catch a break. Again, Sada was one of 8 children. However, only 4 of the 8 children would survive to adulthood. It's unclear what happened to the 4 children that didn't survive, but Sada would end up being the youngest surviving child. And because she was the youngest of the surviving children, her mother did dote on her quite a bit, so she was allowed to have and do whatever she wanted. As a young child, Sada showed a lot of interest in the creative arts. She really enjoyed singing, playing instruments, and performing. And her mother really encouraged this. Her mother was a huge supporter of her exploring her creative side, so she would end up signing her daughter up for singing classes. Along with those singing classes, she also enrolled her daughter in lessons to learn how to play a 3-string traditional Japanese musical instrument called the shamisen. However, back then, singing and playing the shamisen was kind of looked down upon, only because it was so closely associated with geishas and with women whose professions required them to work in the evenings. FYI, I won't be saying the word outright. It does start with a P, but I'm not going to say it in this video just because YouTube doesn't like that sort of stuff. So it's not YouTube friendly. I will not be saying the word outright, but I'm sure you can guess what I'm referring to. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term geisha, it's basically used to describe traditional Japanese female entertainers and hostesses. Geishas sing, they dance, and play instruments to entertain at parties and often do it for wealthy clientele. Now, I also want to just clarify that geishas and the other profession that starts with a P are 2 very different occupations. Things do get a little bit muddy here because back in the day, it was very common for geishas to sleep with their customers. However, this is no longer something that's done in present day. And even though it was common for geishas to sleep with their customers back in the old days, it was still never really an official part of their profession. Just as a side note, I also want to say that I actually had no idea up until I read about this case that geishas did anything but sing, dance, and perform. I always just assumed that they were like entertainers. I had no idea that they did anything else. In my head, I really thought that they were family-friendly and kid-friendly entertainers, so I guess we learn new things every day. Now back to Sada's family. Both of her parents seemed to be pretty normal people, and they were described by their neighbors and friends as good citizens. There were some reports of Sada's father being described as self-centered and someone who just had really expensive taste for the finer things in life. But other than that, they seem to be pretty normal people. However, again, as I mentioned, 4 of their children would pass before reaching adulthood, and I couldn't find much information about what happened to Sada's 4 siblings that passed away, but I can imagine that that was probably a very traumatic and tragic experience for the family. And as Sada was transitioning away from being a preteen and transitioning into becoming a teenager, things started to become increasingly tense in her family. 2 of her siblings were becoming a lot more difficult for her parents to manage. Sada's brother, Shintaro, had started developing a bad reputation for being a womanizer. And after marrying one of his lovers, Shintaro would end up stealing a good amount of money from Sada's parents before fleeing their home to start a new life elsewhere. Sada's sister, Teruko, was also known to have several lovers. And because Teruko was a woman, their father would react in a much different manner than he had with Shintaro. To punish Teruko for her promiscuity, their father would send her to work at a brothel as a lady of the night. Yes, you heard me correctly. Their father had sent Sada's sister to go work at a brothel as punishment for having had multiple lovers. I was honestly super shocked when I found out about this, but I think we also need to remember that this was in the early 1900s and women just didn't have a lot of rights. We just really did not have a lot of rights back then. But here's what's really shocking. This apparently was not an uncommon way for fathers to punish their daughters for being promiscuous back in the day in Japan. And shortly after selling Teruko to this brothel, Sada's father would eventually go back to that brothel and he would buy his daughter back. And she would end up going on to marry some man and beginning her own life. And that was that. Now, back when Sada's siblings, Shintaro and Teruko, were still living in the family home, there was a lot of fighting going on between the siblings and her parents. And whenever these fights would break out in the home, Sada's parents would send her out of the house alone just to avoid having her be a part of these fights or to have her overhear these fights. This freedom that Sada had would eventually lead her to becoming friends with a group of teenagers in her neighborhood. And soon enough, she would find herself in a group of friends that she would spend most of her time with. However, at the age of 15, things would take a really dark turn for Sada. During one of her outings with her friends, she would be assaulted by an acquaintance of somebody in her group. I believe that this one incident really had a huge negative impact on Sada and the life that she would go on to have. From that day onwards, despite her parents' best efforts to provide her with support, she just became an entirely different person. She was no longer the happy and loving Sada that her parents knew. Instead, she became incredibly angry and difficult, irresponsible, and just someone that was just way out of control. And this would lead to her father selling Sada to a geisha house in Yokohama in 1922. Sada was 17 when her father sold her to this geisha house. They had done this in hopes that this new change in Sada's life would be able to provide Sada with a little bit more direction and motivation. And here's what's interesting. Sada's eldest sister Toku, much later on in the case, she would tell people that Sada had wanted to become a geisha and that she had gone to this geisha house of her own free will. However, Sada would come out and deny the statement. She would tell the world that her father had forced her to go to this geisha house and that she had never wanted to do this. This was not in her life plan. So at 17 years old, Sada would find herself thrust into a frustrating and disappointing new world. In this industry, to really shine as a geisha, you'd need to start as an apprentice during your childhood years. And during those years, you'd really have to dedicate all of your time and your energy into mastering the arts and music. And even though Sada did take lessons in singing and playing instruments and performing, she was nowhere near the level that she needed to be in order to become a star. So, because of this, Sada would end up starting as a low-tier geisha. And apparently, one of the main responsibilities for a low-tier geisha is to offer their bodies up to their customers. Again, back then, there seemed to be a really fine line between being a geisha and a sex worker. I suspect that the higher ranking geishas didn't need to partake in those sort of activities. However, the low to mid-tier geishas probably did, just because, out of necessity. I did read in my research that work in Japan pays so much more than what a low to mid-tier geisha would be paid without the activities involved. So in Sada's case, she didn't really have a choice. She was sold into this geisha house by her father, and she didn't have the skills to become a high-ranking geisha. So she needed to partake in those sort of activities, and it would be very unfortunate because 5 years into her work, she would contract syphilis. Now, here's another interesting piece of information that I found out online. In Japan, sex workers are required by law to be licensed to do what they do. And this means that they're in the government system and that they also have to undergo regular STD testing. And this law apparently also applies to low and mid-tier geishas. But here's the catch. It only applies to them if they've caught an STD. So if they've never caught an STD before, then they don't need to be licensed to do what they do. Because again, being a geisha and a sex worker, they're two different occupations. Very muddy, fine line there, but they are separate professions. Now, at this point, Sada has come to the realization that she no longer wants to be a geisha. She realizes that the money is just a lot better if she just becomes a full-time sex worker. And honestly, she's been doing this profession as a geisha for 5 years now. She's kind of over it. She wants to try something new. So she decides to quit her geisha house. Also, I do have my suspicions that she only really stayed in this geisha house for as long as she did, mainly because she had to pay off her debt in order to leave the geisha house. Because don't forget, her father sold her to this geisha house. So in order for her to leave, she would need to work off that money, essentially, because they purchased her. The house purchased her as an employee, and the only way that she could have her freedom is to give them the money that they paid her father for. So in the early 1930s, while Sada was in her mid-20s, she would decide to become a full-time sex worker. She would begin her new profession in Osaka's famous Tobita brothel district. And shortly after beginning her new profession, Sada's new employers would quickly come to learn just how troublesome Sada could be. While working at the brothel, Sada had gained the reputation as a troublemaker, and she would be caught on numerous occasions stealing money from her customers. Sada would also come to realize that she didn't like this profession. She didn't like working in a brothel, and she would try leaving this brothel several times. However, you couldn't just put in your resignation and leave. My theory here is that she probably had debts to pay off at this brothel, and that's why they didn't let her go, because she wasn't done paying off her debts. However, I'm not sure. If you do know about this, please leave it in the comments, because I would be really interested to hear how that actually works. Now, after 2 years of working at this one brothel, Sada would eventually somehow manage to escape. And once she escaped, she would decide that she didn't want to continue on in this profession. It was way too hard for her to leave the brothel in the first place. So she didn't really feel like going to a new brothel because she was a little bit traumatized by how much she hated the brothel that she was working in and just how hard it was to escape that system. So she would decide to pick up a normal job. She would find work as a waitress, but unfortunately, this occupation didn't sit too well with her. Sada quickly became tired of the long hours and the really, really low pay, so eventually she would make the decision to go back into sex work. And instead of going back to a licensed and legal brothel and risking not being able to leave again, she would decide to find work in an unlicensed brothel in Osaka. However, in 1933, before Sada could find a new job in Osaka, she would be called back to Tokyo because her mother had fallen very ill and had passed away. And upon arriving back to Tokyo, Sada would realize that she really missed the city. She really missed her home, and maybe it was time for her to find some work in Tokyo instead of going to the other cities. Now, in 1934, two monumental things would happen in Sada's life. The first thing being that she, for the very first time in her life, would become a mistress. And the second thing being that her father, her only surviving parent, had now fallen very, very ill. Sada would spend 10 days with her father in Tokyo, trying to nurse him back to health, but unfortunately, he didn't survive his illness and would pass away. And I really do think that despite what her father had done to her, Sada really did love her parents. And to have both of her parents gone and her siblings spread out across the country, I definitely think she felt very alone. And I'm sure that the deaths of her parents had a huge impact on her as well. So after her father's passing, Sada would throw herself fully into her work. And in October of 1934, while working in an unlicensed brothel, Sada would be arrested during a police raid. And now, this is where a man by the name of Kinosuke Kasahara would come into the picture. Kinosuke was a very wealthy and very well-connected man who also happened to be friends with the brothel's owner. So when he saw Sada being arrested, he, for whatever reason, just fell in love. It was like love at first sight for him. He was immediately attracted to Sada, and after confirming with the brothel owner that Sada had no debts with the brothel, he would go up to Sada and he would ask Sada if she would be interested in being his mistress. Sada would agree, and that was that. She was now a mistress. Kinosuke would pull some strings and would manage to get Sada released from jail, and the two would begin an affair. On December 20th, 1934, Kinosuke would set Sada up in a new home and would provide her with money on a monthly basis to ensure that she was well cared for. And boy, did these two have a really interesting relationship. When Kinosuke was interviewed by the police much later on in Sada's case, he would make the following statement. She was really strong, a real powerful one. Even though I am pretty jaded, she was enough to astound me. She wasn't satisfied unless we did it 2, 3, or 4 times a night. To her, it was unacceptable unless I had my hands on her private parts all night long. At first, it was great, but after a couple of weeks, I got a little exhausted. Really just TMI. Also, before we jump into this case, I do want to just give you guys a disclaimer that there are some sensitive topics discussed in this video, and this video is definitely not kid-friendly. I don't know why children would be watching my video. I hope children aren't watching my videos because some of my videos do talk about a lot of really sensitive topics, but this one is like 100% not suitable for children. This has a lot of topics that are very adult topics. So yes, just Watch at your own discretion. So it sounds like Kinosuke and Sada had a very sexual relationship. They had a very passionate one, and it sounds like it was so passionate that even Kinosuke just couldn't keep up. Kinosuke would then also tell the authorities during his interview that things really did seem to start off really well and they were going fine until Sada had demanded that Kinosuke leave his wife. He obviously refused because back then leaving your wife for your mistress was just a huge no-no. You marry one person, you stay with that person until one of you dies. Like, that's it. So anyways, Sada's like, okay, fine. If you won't leave your wife, can I at least have another lover? Because again, she's sharing this man with his wife. And I mean, I'm sure his wife knew about it because back then, like having a mistress was super common and it was just the norm. She didn't want to just continue sharing him with his wife because she probably felt lonely. So she was like, fine, like if you're going to force me to continue being a mistress and to like keep sharing you, just allow me to take on another lover so I'm a little bit less lonely. Kinosuke's like, no, absolutely not. You're absolutely not allowed to take on any lovers. And this created a lot of tension between Sada and her lover. And the relationship would only come to an end when Sada would flee to Nagoya just to get away from him. So they didn't really have like a proper breakup. She just upped and left. She was like, nope, I'm done with this. Like, I'm not dealing with this anymore. So she left the house that he put her up in. And yeah, she just went and started an entirely new life in Nagoya. And from what I've gathered through my research, it seems like the two of them had a lot of resentment towards one another. Kinosuke just was not happy about the way the relationship ended. I mean, she did up and leave him, but he was really resentful and he would tell the authorities the following statements. She is a and as what she has done makes clear, she is a woman whom men should fear. And this statement would be followed by Sada's own statements about her ex. He didn't love me and treated me like an animal. He was the kind of who would then plead with me when I said that we should break up. So honestly, it does sound like they had a very toxic relationship. Who knows what actually went on during their relationship? And just because he's paying for her to live somewhere, when I say her, I mean Sada, just because he's paying for her to live somewhere and gives her money every month, doesn't mean he was necessarily treating her right. Sada would flee from her short-lived relationship in 1935 and would end up settling in Nagoya. She had become tired of the sex industry and she would decide once again that she wanted out. So she began working as a maid in a restaurant, and this is where she would meet a customer named Goro Omiya, who was a professor and a banker. However, due to the restaurant's strict policy about employees dating customers and just being overall bored with the city that she was living in, she would decide that it was time for her to move back to Tokyo in June of 1935. However, Goro, who was still infatuated with Sada, would decide to follow Sada to Tokyo, only to arrive and discover that she had once again contracted syphilis. But he didn't seem to mind. In fact, he was super sweet about it. He would end up paying for Sada to stay in a hot springs resort in Kusatsu from November until January 1936. He would visit her regularly and would advise her to start her own business, maybe open a restaurant so that she could become financially independent. He didn't really want her going back to the work industry just because, well, one, she's contracted syphilis twice now, and two, it just wasn't a sustainable, healthy occupation. Now, because Sada had no experience running her own business, Goro would advise her to find an apprentice position in a restaurant so that she could learn the ins and outs and then one day start her own business. Sada thought that this was a great idea, and after leaving the hot springs resort, she would go back to Tokyo and would find work in a restaurant on February 1st, 1936. And this is where she would meet Kichizo Ishida. And this is also where love, obsession, and tragedy would come into play. Kichizo was 42 years old at the time that he met Sada. He was also the owner of the restaurant that Sada had been employed in, and he had worked his way up in the industry. In fact, he had begun his career working as an apprentice in an eel industry before opening his own establishment in 1920. Now here's the kicker. Kichizo ran the restaurants with his wife, and he was known to be a huge womanizer and also did very little in running the business. His wife took on the majority of the responsibilities in the restaurant, and within weeks of Sada's employment, Kichizo would begin making advances towards her. And Sada was attracted to Kichizo, so she gave in. And mind you, this was all happening while his wife was also at the restaurant. And apparently in mid-April, so just months after she began working there, the two would make their affair official. They would make their affair official by doing it in Kichizo's restaurant, while one of the restaurant's geishas was singing a romantic ballad. You guys heard me correctly. They had sex in the restaurant with people there to make their affair official. And from that day onward, the pair would launch themselves into a passionate love affair. They would pre-arrange meetings at love hotels and would spend up to 4 or 5 days at a time just laying in bed and doing whatever they were doing. On April 23rd, 1936, they would begin a love marathon that would last until May 8th. Kichizo had literally not gone to work until May 8th because he was too busy doing whatever he was doing with his mistress. Again, I am convinced that Kichizo's wife knew all about this affair, because how could he disappear for almost 2 weeks without an issue, basically? Sada was completely obsessed and madly in love with this new lover of hers, and I think he also felt the same way about her. Later on, during one of her trials, she would speak about Kichizo and their love affair. It is hard to say exactly what was so good about Ishida, but it was impossible to say anything bad about his looks, his attitude, his skill as a lover, the way he expressed his feelings. I had never met such a sexy man. It honestly seemed like Sada had never experienced true love before she met Kichizo. She would become agitated and would begin drinking excessively whenever he wasn't around her. And eventually, she would become jealous at the idea of him going home to his wife. And this is when Sada begins to spiral. On May 9th, just one day after her lover had returned to work and had gone back to his wife, Sada would attend a play. In this play, a geisha had attacked her lover with a large knife. And this, for some reason, had given Sada the inspiration to use the same tactic on her lover. On May 11th, Sada would pawn her clothes and use the money to purchase a large knife as well as some sushi. She was meeting with Kichizo that evening, and she had something spicy planned for him. In her retelling of the events that took place, she would recount to the investigators, "I pulled the kitchen knife out of my bag and threatened him as been done in the play I had seen, saying, 'Kichi, you wore that kimono just to please one of your favorite customers. You bastard, I'll kill you for that.'" Ishida was startled and drew away a little, but he seemed delighted with it all. Sada and Kichizo would venture out on another love marathon, and this time they would do so in the neighborhood of Oku. Little would Kichizo know that he would never again return home to his wife. What these two got up to was very, very kinky, so I'll try to keep it as YouTube friendly as possible. But on the very first night of their love marathon, Sada would take out the large kitchen knife that she had purchased, and she would, in the middle of their romantic activities, start playing with this knife. And she would take the knife, and place it at the base of her partner's private areas. She then tells him that she could make sure that he was never ever able to use those areas with anybody else but her. And Kichizo, thinking that, this was just part of their little kinky play, just laughed it off. Now, 2 nights into their little love marathon, things would get a little bit more heated when Sada would begin choking her lover. Kichizo even ended up liking it and would end up encouraging her to do it over and over again, and they would even take turns doing it to each other. On May 16th, things would continue to get even more heated when the two of them would continue on with their choking activities, but this time they would use the belt of a kimono. And before dozing off, Sada's lover had allegedly said to her the following statement: "You'll put the cord around my neck and squeeze it again while I'm sleeping, won't you? If you start to strangle me, don't stop, because it is so painful afterward." This made Sada wonder if he was implying that he had wanted her to take his life. Soon after having that thought, she pushed it out of her head and just assumed that he was joking. And this would continue to happen for the next few days. Their activities would continue on. That is, until May 18th, at around 2 a.m., when Sada would take the belt of her kimono, which is called a sash, and she would wrap it around her lover's neck and choke him until he was no longer breathing. She would then lay beside him, cuddling him for hours. And when speaking with officers later on, she would tell them, "After I killed Ishida, I felt totally at ease, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from my shoulders, and I felt a sense of clarity." And hours after her lover had taken his last breath, Sada would take the knife that she had purchased, and she would sever off his private parts. She would then wrap them in a magazine cover, place them in her purse, and keep them with her at all times until her arrest a few days later. Before leaving the hotel room, Sada would use blood to write Sada, Kichi, together on Kichizo's left thigh as well as on the bed. She then also would use blood to write her name on his left arm. After doing all of that, Sada would put on Kichizo's underwear and would exit the room around 8 a.m. And she would tell the maids to not enter the room because Kichizo was sleeping and didn't want to be disturbed. She would then leave the hotel entirely. Later, when the investigators asked her why she had kept his private parts with her, she would make the following statement: "Because I couldn't take his head or body with me. I wanted to take the part of him that brought back to me the most vivid memories." And after leaving the hotel and her lover's body, Sada would go back to Goro. And when she had reunited with Goro, she would apologize to him over and over and over again. And Goro would assume that the apologies were because Sada had left him for another man, and that was why she felt sorry. But actually, Sada was apologizing for what she had done in the motel with Kichizo. And she knew that once the truth came out, Goro's political career would be over. She knew that her association with Goro would be the death of his career once the papers and the authorities caught up to her. And Sada was right. When news of Kichizo's death started spreading across the nation on May 19th, both Sada and Goro's lives would be forever changed. When the story was picked up by the press, people just went nuts. Everyone who knew Sada and Kichizo knew right away that Sada was involved somehow, because the pair weren't exactly secretive about their affair. So when his body was discovered in the hotel and the investigation was started, the entire nation had begun a search for Sada. Authorities were receiving countless reports of sightings of Sada throughout Japan, and honestly, this crime really had become the talk of the country. Sada, on the other hand, didn't seem too worried about being caught. On May 19th, she even took herself out shopping and even went for a solo movie date. The following day, she even checked into an inn in Shinagawa under an alias and went for a massage and had some drinks. She then spent the entire day writing farewell letters to Kichizo, to Goro, and to another friend of hers. Her plan was to take her own life by jumping off Mount Ikoma with Kichizo's private parts, which she still carried with her. Now, what's really disturbing here is that during the time that she had kept the private parts with her, Sada had even practiced necrophilia with those private parts. She would even tell investigators the details of how she did it, but I won't be sharing those details in this video, but you can definitely find that information online. It's pretty disturbing. So on May 20th at around 4 p.m., Sada would receive a knock at the door of her hotel room. And when she opened the door, she would find the authorities standing in front of her room. Apparently, the staff at the inn or the hotel had become suspicious of Sada's behavior and of Sada's alias. So they contacted the authorities and asked them to come and check things out, which they did. And when she opened the door for the authorities, she didn't even seem surprised. She didn't seem upset or startled whatsoever. She simply said to them, "Don't be so formal. You're looking for Sada Abe, right? Well, that's me. I am Sada Abe." And initially, because she was so chill about this, they didn't believe that it was actually her. So what does she end up doing? Well, she goes to her purse, she pulls out the evidence, and then she shows it to the authorities. After Sada was arrested, she would go through 8 rounds of questioning. The investigators who had interrogated her were really taken aback by her reaction when they asked her why she killed Kichizo. She had become all excited at the question, and they noted that her eyes had a bit of a sparkle to them when she answered. "I loved him so much. I wanted him all to myself. But since we were not husband and wife, as long as he lived, he could be embraced by other women. I knew that if I killed him, no other woman could touch him again, so I killed him." She claims that she didn't kill him out of jealousy, but she had done so out of love. Several experts believe that it was this very answer that gripped the nation's attention. After her arrest, Kichizo's 7 private parts would end up at the Pathology Museum at Tokyo University Medical School. They were publicly displayed after her arrest. However, after World War II, they would vanish, and no one knows where they've disappeared to. It's kind of creepy. I don't know who would have taken it. I have a feeling that maybe a fan of this case maybe broke into the museum and had stolen it. I don't know. I mean, it was a really, really huge, sensational case in Japan. So I could imagine just someone who was just super interested in this going in, stealing it, and then just keeping it for themselves. Again, like super, super creepy, but I can totally imagine someone doing that. But who knows? So Sada's trial would kick off on November 25th, 1936. And by the break of dawn, people were already lining up outside of the courtroom. Again, this was one of the most sensational true crime cases in Japan. It was incredibly popular, and people would have done anything just to get a little bit of access to the information shared in that courtroom. It really was such a shocking and scandalous crime. So much so that even the judge who presided over this case was left speechless at times. The judge in charge of Sada's case even confessed to the public that he got a little bit turned on by some of the information shared. However, he did reportedly keep things very professional and made sure the trial was handled the right way. but I'm still so surprised that he would come out and confess that to the public. Reporters who were in that courtroom had also done their best to try to share as much information as possible about Sada's testimony. But because of how sexual and bizarre this case was, the government did begin censoring some parts that they deemed too inappropriate for the public. People were so fascinated about this case that the media began calling it the Sada mania, as well as calling young women who were following this case religiously Sada fans. Now, Sada was not the only focus of attention for this trial. Her previous lover, Goro, was also called to the stand, and he was also looked upon as a suspect. He was detained and questioned, and police suspected that he may have been involved in some parts of this murder. This would prove to be untrue, and he would be cleared. However, Goro's political and academic career would not survive the scandal, and he would end up having to resign from his posts and essentially vanishing from the public eye. I feel so bad for Goro because he seemed like such a nice guy. He treated Sada super well, it seems, and he had nothing to do with what happened. So I feel really bad that his career and his personal life suffered greatly from her actions. As for Kichizo's wife, she was devastated when the news came out, but she would continue running their family business. And the restaurant would end up doing super well because of all the publicity around the case. People were so wonky about this case that so many people would actually flock to the inn where Kichizo had passed away. And there were couples that would request this to stay in the same exact room that he had died in. Now, before Sada was sentenced, she would give the following statements. The thing I regret most about this incident is that I have come to be misunderstood as some kind of sexual pervert. There had never been a man in my life like Ishida. There were men I liked and with whom I slept without accepting money, but none made me feel the way I did toward him. And when the verdict was read out loud on December 21st, 1936, Sada would be found guilty for second-degree murder and the mutilation of a corpse. The prosecution was gunning for a 10-year sentence. However, Sada even said herself that she desired and wanted the death penalty. She wanted to join her lover in the afterlife, but in the end, she would only end up receiving a 6-year sentence. After the sentencing, she would be moved to Tochiki's women's prison, where she was known as prisoner number 11. Now, the judge did lay out his reasons for the 6-year sentence. He pointed out that Kichizo did play a part in the whole mess leading up to his death. They took into consideration the fact that he had encouraged Sada to do the choking and all the other kinky things they did. He also talked about Sada's mental health at the time, even though Sada didn't agree. Her lawyer kept saying she was mentally not well when she committed the murder. The judge ended up saying that the sentence would give Sada enough time to reflect and to get her life together while in prison. He was optimistic that Sada would be able to have a fresh start after her sentence was over. And honestly, Sada's time in prison turned out to be one of the greatest things to have happened to her. She reportedly had a solid routine and tons of stability while in prison. Honestly, things that she didn't really have for a very, very long time, especially considering all of the chaos that went on in her household when she was younger, and then being sold to a geisha house and all of the other things that happened to her after she left home. Sada had even described the people around her in the prison to be loving and caring people, and she would develop friendships with both her fellow inmates and the staff. However, her sentencing would be cut short by a year when on May 17, 1941, Sada would be released due to her being a model prisoner. But life outside of prison would prove to be much more difficult for Sada than it was within the prison. People hadn't forgotten who Sada was, nor had they forgotten what she did. No matter where she went, she was constantly hounded by reporters and was kept in the public eye. And as soon as she was released, she had to keep taking on fake names to avoid the public fascination that kept following her everywhere. And at this point, because she had no income yet, because she wasn't able to get a job due to all the difficulties we just mentioned, she would move in with her older sister and her brother-in-law. According to a memoir that Sada would write in 1948 called Memoirs of Abe Sada, Sada would disguise herself by using the name Yoshi Mosako and would begin working as a maid. However, shortly after being employed as a maid, she would be let go from her work as soon as her employers found out who she really was. In her memoir, Sada would also recount her meeting a man who she calls Y, and who she would describe to be a very serious man. She had written in her memoir that Y had asked her to become his mistress. And Sada had reluctantly agreed to it because of her not so great circumstances. However, Sada would also write that after several years of being together, she would have to call off her relationship with Y after his family discovered her true identity. Sada was honestly quite devastated by the fact that her name was now poisonous. The public thought of her as a sex pervert, and she felt greatly misunderstood. In her mind, the actions that she took, or the crime that she committed, she did it out of love and not out of jealousy or because of some kink. She was in love with the man, and she truly in her bones felt like what she did out of love and passion. Now, Sada would begin noticing a shift after World War II in regards to how people were viewing sexuality. Japan's government had wanted to divert attention away from politics and the current standing of the country after the war. So they would begin loosening the strict hold on censorship of the media and of materials that could be deemed obscene or too provocative or immoral. And because of this more liberalized change, Sada would find herself becoming a symbol of sexuality and freedom. While pre-war Sada was considered to be immoral and a degenerate, post-war Sada was thought to be a feminist and an icon of independence for women. Pre-war, the author of The Psychological Diagnosis of Abe Sada, 1937, painted Sada as a threat to the patriarchal system and used her as an example about the dangers of female sexuality. However, in 1946, a writer named Engo Sakaguchi would interview Sada for his own book and would describe her to be tender, warm figure of salvation for future generations. Now this was a stark contrast to the person that people had made Sada out to be prior to the war. However, while there were now people who viewed Sada as an icon, there were still people who thought of her as a sex pervert. One writer, Ikiro Kimura, would fall into the latter category. His 1947 book, The Erotic Confessions of Abe Sada, would become an instant hit, with over 100,000 copies sold. And the book had been written as if it were created based on his direct interviews with Sada, when in reality, he had based it all off of police interrogation records. This would prompt Sada to sue Kimura for libel and defamation of character, and then led Sada to writing her own memoir, which I mentioned earlier. Kimura's book was very much focused on depicting Sada as a pervert, so she wanted to come out with her own book in order to share her side of the story and to stress her love for her deceased lover. However, the results of the lawsuits have not been made public because the two did settle things out of court. Now, Sada did begin capitalizing on her fame by participating in interviews as well as showing up in popular shows and magazines and appearing on traveling stages. But because of her notoriety and the stigma surrounding her past, there wasn't a lot made available to her in terms of work. So in 1952, Sada would begin working in pubs and restaurants in an area called Inarocho, Tokyo. She would actually continue working in pubs and restaurants in this area for almost 20 years, while also living a seemingly low-profile life, or as low profile as possible considering her circumstances. Sada was even given an award from her employers for being a model employee. So it really seems like she was just really focused on working normal jobs and trying to survive and just doing her best with the situation that she was in. Sometime in the 1960s, a film critic by the name of Donald Ritchie would visit one of the venues that Sada was working at, and he recounted a time where Sada was making a dramatic entrance into the restaurant filled with people drinking and hanging out. She would make her way into the crowd of customers by descending this long staircase, and when people saw her, they would begin teasing her. There were people commenting like, "Hide the knives," or "Oh my god, I'm afraid to go and pee," all while holding and covering their private parts. This would anger Sada, and she would hit the banister with her hands and glare into the crowd until everyone became silent. Only then, when she had full silence in the room, would she continue descending from the stairs, and she would start making her way over to each table, pouring drinks and chatting with the customers. Donald stated that even decades after this crime, people were still fascinated with this woman. She had actually choked a man to death and then cut off his member. There was a consequent prison when Sada Abe slapped her back. In 1969, Sada would make an appearance in a dramatized documentary called History of Bizarre Crimes by Women in the Meiji Taisho and Showa eras. The director had asked her to join for a segment called the Sada Abe Incident, and that would be her final public appearance in anything related to the crime. And in August of 1969, this would be the last photo taken of Sada. In 1970, Sada would completely vanish from the face of the earth. There were rumors of her possibly having taken her own life or joining a convent, but these rumors were never confirmed and an official date of death has never been stated. However, in the mid-1970s, director Nagisa Oshima had sought Sada out and claimed that he had found her after a very long search. He had found Sada in a Kansai nunnery, but I wasn't able to confirm the accuracy of this claim. And despite Sada's disappearance, fascination around her case has never ended. There have been countless documentaries, plays, movies, and books created about this woman. People to this day are still wondering, what happened to Sada Abe? Whatever her fate was, one thing is for sure. The world is never going to forget this notorious woman, whether that be as a feminist icon or a notorious murderer. And I find it incredibly intriguing that she's been described as both things by people from all over the world. Honestly, I do find it very disturbing what she did. But what's really interesting to me is that there are people out there who don't believe that she's evil. And even after her release, there were people who accepted her into their community, and they didn't see her as a threat. They didn't see her as an evil human being. They honestly just accepted her for who she was and for what happened, and they moved on with it. But let me know what you guys think about Sada Abe, because I still haven't made up my mind. I am incredibly intrigued about her case and fascinated with this woman's history. What are your thoughts on Sada, and what do you think really happened to her after her disappearance? And what do you guys think happened to Kichizo's private parts that disappeared from the museum? I look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments below. And again, thank you so much for tuning in for another video. As always, if you have any case recommendations, please feel free to shoot them through to truecrimebygenta@gmail.com. And I look forward to seeing you guys in my next video. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day, guys. Bye.